I mean, one of the things that's really interesting for me is thinking about social media. Okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to take a few minutes now to talk about some of my research and think about how this might map onto the uncertain times that we're living in today. And it was great to just hear Anne talking about her research, because in lots of ways there's a lot of resonances with the research that I'm interested in. So one of the strands of my research is really about exploring how we talk about and think about inequality. So what do we think causes inequality? How inequality gets explained, how it gets described, how far we think inequalities of different kinds are acceptable, perhaps even desirable. There's all sorts of interesting moments where inequality has been celebrated or seen as part of a wider natural order. So Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, for example, has written and spoken about inequality before as being a good thing because it helps people aim or aspire towards something. So I'm interested in thinking about that and how we talk about or how we think about solutions to inequality, how we might pursue inequality and what we think a more equal society might look like. And thinking about how media and culture maps onto that, one of the questions that I'm really interested in thinking about is how we use media to communicate those ideas about inequality to one another, how we use media to build a shared consensus about what equality looks like, what it might look like, and how we might get there. So this part of my research maps onto a bigger research and teaching concern across the whole department, which is sort of encapsulated in our new research centre, the Centre for Alternatives to Social and Economic Inequalities. And lots of colleagues across the department are interested in thinking about the textures and ideas around equality and inequality. And of course, that's so crucial right now because we know that inequalities of all kinds are widening, particularly under the current pandemic circumstances. So we're seeing lots of new inequalities opening up, digital inequalities, for example, and some older inequalities where there had been some progress. And we're now seeing that progress starting to stall or even go into reverse, and those inequalities are starting to widen. So around health inequalities, for example. So you can get a sense of the range of some of that research and teaching that we do on this particular theme of inequality by looking at this new research centre in particular. So one of the main strands of my research on inequality is around welfare and the welfare state. And thinking about that from the perspective of media and cultural studies, one of the things that I'm really interested in investigating is where do these ideas about welfare come from? What are the histories of some of these ideas? How do these ideas get communicated? And how do we use media and culture to communicate those ideas about welfare? So when we use the term media and culture, we're using this in quite a broad way. It might refer to film, newspapers, television, social media, but it might also include things like public campaigns, advocacy and all sorts of campaigning initiatives. It might involve activities like signing petitions. It might involve music. It might involve meme culture. So really we're thinking about media in terms of all the different places where we represent the world, where we imagine the world, where we connect with others and share ideas about the world. And importantly, I think where we act upon the world. So media can also be a place where we're doing particular forms of action. So one of the questions that I'm interested in is how do we use media and cultural interfaces to talk about and discuss and negotiate and challenge and perhaps confirm some of the ideas that we hold about welfare, and what different kinds of media sites and spaces we use to inform ourselves about the welfare state. Which sources do we trust? What strategies and tactics do media producers and organisations and distributors use to get our attention on welfare and to generate consensus and convince us and persuade us of particular messages about welfare? So I'm really interested in investigating those media processes critically and using different kinds of tools to research those questions. One of the big questions really at the heart of this strand of my research has been about how does the media get used to build consensus about welfare, and thinking about that historically, but also thinking about that in the present day and into the future. One of the architects of the welfare state was this guy here, William Beveridge, the guy you can see on the top right of your screen. He wrote the blueprint for the welfare state in the 1940s. And Beveridge really understood the power of media in generating consensus for new ideas. So Beveridge used all sorts of short films and pamphlets to generate excitement about this ambitious new plan that he had for a national welfare system. And this is a still from one of the films that he made. And we can also think about the current moments in contemporary welfare politics, the different ways that media of different kinds get used to generate and circulate ideas about welfare. So we might think, for example, about reality television. We might think about public campaigns, about benefit fraud. We might think about the constant newspaper stories about benefit scroungers. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is thinking critically about this media and cultural world and investigating these systems that seek to produce particular ideas about the world, and in this case, about welfare. And really recognising that these systems are political. They are about maintaining particular forms of power. They work in the interests of particular groups, and really developing a critical vocabulary for thinking about those kinds of practices. At the same time, doing media and cultural studies also means thinking critically about how media might be used to challenge and resist some of those ideas that can often feel quite established. So thinking about how do we bring about change in the world? How do we go into the future? What kind of future world do we move into? And how do we use media and culture to change existing ideas and bring about ideas that we want to see in the future? So really one of the bigger questions, I think, across the department that we're all engaged in different ways is how do we bring about that change? How can we take action upon the world that we live in and what we're thinking about as part of our study? And of course, in part, we might do that through the media. We might think about all the ways that we respond to media about welfare. For example, how do we speak back to news stories? How do we share them? Where do we share them? How do we complain about inaccuracies or bias? But we also might think about how we make media. We live in a media saturated world, but it's also a media making world. We're very used to producing content of different kinds, reworking or remixing content that's already out there in some way and making our own media. So we might think about photography, writing, social media activity of all kinds, video production, animation, collage, fan art, fan fiction, retweeting, sharing, connecting with others using media of all kinds. So we're living in a really interesting moment to be thinking about media and culture as part of our intellectual life, precisely because this moment is one that offers so many opportunities for us to make and circulate media. So I've got some examples here on the slide of some media making that I've been exploring or I've been inspired by, or I've been involved in as part of my bigger research strand on welfare. So Fighting Shame is a really interesting short film made last year about women, by women in Leeds who were experiencing poverty. And this was a really interesting media collaboration between a research and campaigning organisation called the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, The Guardian, which is a more sort of conventional news media organisation, and community activist groups in Leeds. So this is an example of the really interesting experiments that can happen in media collaboration. On the right of your screen, you'll see a screen grab from an animation called Dole Animators. Again, a creative collaboration between researchers and animators and activists making media about welfare that challenges some of those damaging ideas that circulate about what it's like to live on benefits, what it's like to claim benefits. And at the bottom, I've included here some pages from a project that I've been involved in most recently, which is making a zine. A zine is a DIY magazine, which in this case was about how we imagine welfare and what kinds of hopes we have for the future of welfare. So part of my research is always thinking critically about media, investigating the ways that we're already engaged in media. But as part of your intellectual studies, you'll also be learning about how to do research about and on the media using different kinds of tools to investigate media, to untangle media meaning, to think about the systems that make it work. learning how to present your ideas and your arguments and write persuasively about media. But you'll also have lots of opportunities to make media as well as part of your degree programme. Lots of options that we offer which give you the opportunity to make short videos, films, memes, digital art, zines, media campaigns, and a whole range of other media objects. So it's about thinking critically about media, but then also thinking about how do we make media, how do we speak back to media in our own creative media practice. All of this is important because we're living in really uncertain times. There's some very old certainties about how these moments of crisis, like the pandemic, they always disproportionately impact upon those who are already at the bottom rungs of society. And already we're seeing lots of evidence mounting that this pandemic is disproportionately impacting ethnic minorities, people living in poverty, people with disabilities, people who are living in care homes or sheltered accommodation. And there's lots of visualizations of these statistics and data about inequality. But there's also lots of uncertainty. How will these statistics and data be transformed into a consensus? What is that consensus going to look like in the future? What part will the media play in helping us to imagine and connect and represent and share ideas about the pandemic? In some ways, media and culture will be used to communicate reassuring messages that everything is in hand, that the government is doing a good job, that we're on a good path to the future. And I was struck this morning by an article published in the Daily Mail saying exactly this. What's interesting is that this was content that was sponsored by the UK government. So this is a really interesting example of government-sponsored propaganda. And I think that connects a lot to what Anne was saying about PR and about how the data is being spun in all sorts of interesting ways. But in other ways, we might also see media as a place where we can initiate and engage our critical minds. And there's another nice example here on this slide of how investigative journalism and commentary is using the pandemic to open up bigger questions about inequality and what it looks like and what we want the future to look like. So there's a really clear struggle happening right now across media and across culture about what the pandemic consensus will look like. And I think moments of crisis like this are really crucial because they are precisely where new ways of thinking about the world start to emerge and start to become visible. How do we represent our unequal world? How do we imagine equality going into the future? So this is a strange time in a lot of ways to be starting university study, and we recognise that, but it's also a fantastically interesting and important time to be beginning your critical investigations of media and culture and to be thinking about how these systems and industries work and what kinds of engagements and interventions we can make upon them. On the question of platforms, it's really, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting for me is thinking about social media as this really lively space where we're contesting some of the more sort of formal or official or established consensus ideas about welfare. So it's particularly interesting to think about social media as a space where some of that citizen journalism that Anne was referring to gets done. Excuse me. I see there's a question as well about whether some of the inequality that people are feeling now is stuff that we can't really see because it's at home. And I think that's a really interesting question as well that probably connects to your question about platforms. So there's a bigger set of questions really about how do we make visible inequalities? At what moments do those inequalities become visible? And how the pandemic has sort of shone a spotlight really on inequalities that were perhaps not necessarily publicly discussed in a very extended way. And I think a couple of things sort of came to mind when I was thinking about this. In one way, one of the examples of the kinds of hidden inequalities that the pandemic sort of shone a light on is around gender. So precisely in the lockdown, everybody's been told if it's possible to go home and work from home. And that has created all sorts of really interesting visibility around the kinds of gendered inequalities in the home. Who tends to take care of children? Who tends to do care work? That is a very gendered set of expectations and obligations. And I think in some ways we kind of, it's very easy to forget that gendered labour around care. And I think the pandemic in a way has sort of forced a spotlight on some of those questions. Another way that the it's sort of usually invisible inequalities have become visible in the pandemic is through people losing their jobs, becoming unemployed, and having to make claims on the welfare state. So we know, for example, in the first month of lockdown, more than 1 million new claims were made on the welfare state in the form of universal credit. And in a way that created a real crisis around the welfare state and how it hasn't been working for a very long time. The amount of money that people can claim in welfare benefits is quite small compared to other countries. But in a way that's been a kind of hidden inequality. When the pandemic has happened and lockdown has happened and all these new claims upon the welfare state have been made, it's kind of forced it into the spotlight in a new way. And of course, what's interesting is when things come into the spotlight, that's when it's the opportunity to challenge the consensus around those things and perhaps offer new ways of designing the world and offer new solutions to those hidden inequalities. So really interesting questions.